All right, we're talking about the Lusitania. We talked so far about the start of World War I and how all the contributing factors led up to this as far as Europe's involvement, but now we'll kind of start talking about that slow progression to get the United States involved. The Lusitania played a role in that. As we talked about, the Germans went to great length to warn the United States not to ride foreign ships. We didn't listen. And so on May of 1915, Germans sunk a British passenger ship off the coast of Ireland, killing 1,200 people. There were 128 Americans on board that ship. It was a British ship off the coast of Italy. So we knew not to be on it, but we were anyway. As soon as that ship got sunk, both sides kind of understood the importance of either keeping the United States out or possibly bringing them in as an ally to tip the balance in that stalemate that Europe had going on the Western Front. So the Germans claimed, and what turned out to be correctly so, that the British were smuggling war goods over on these passenger ships, knowing that the Germans wouldn't sink those ships, and if they did, that it might help get them an ally. The British, of course, came through and railed on the Germans for having killed passengers and innocent civilians and what a terrible person they were. Americans tended to side with the British in all of this. There are a lot of first-generation German Americans here, so it wasn't an easy case for the British, but they did convince the majority of the American people that they should support Britain in this. But Germany then quickly went to unrestricted submarine warfare in order to keep the United States out of it. They promised to surface and warn all vessels before sinking them. That way, if there's any passengers on board, they can get off. And that helped keep America out of the war, kind of calmed the anger that the United States had for Germany. And it's going to be 2 years before we end up getting involved. But this is at least part of what gets American sentiment behind it. Kind of the same thing that all the newspaper articles from Pulitzer and Hertz during the Spanish-American War lead up got us behind the Cubans, and then when the USS Maine was sunk, that was the spark that got us involved. Similar thing here. This isn't going to get us in the war, but it is going to get the American people choosing sides. War by 1915, by the time this happened, had become a war of attrition. The word attrition is the natural rate of decline, and the war had lost all strategic objective by this point. The old strategy of the Schlieffen Plan and swinging around, taking out Paris, trapping their army, turning and fighting Russia, that was all gone. At this point, both sides were dug in, and trying to make any big gains was very, very difficult. So they settled on a policy of just continually attacking, probing, and wearing down the enemy. This is when all these new weapons start to enter into the warfare in an attempt to hopefully turn the tide, try to inflict as much damage as possible. And so for the next 3 years in Europe, in the trenches, it's just going to be very, very bloody fighting for very little ground. It's kind of during this time that this warfare starts to wear on some of the other powers at play. In Russia, they were not very industrialized at the beginning of the war to begin with. That's one of the whole reasons why the Schlieffen Plan was put into place. The thought was Russia was so disorganized that they would lose the war, not be ready to fight right away, and then you could knock out France and then go and fight Russia. And it was true. Russia's economy wasn't as industrialized as the rest of Europe. They couldn't afford to pay for this war. Two truisms of war. People are going to die, and it's going to cost money. And so the Russian government was short on food. They had inadequate infrastructure with poor roads, poor supplies for their army. It took a long time to get the needed supplies across the vast, large country of Russia. And so the Tsar himself, Nicholas II, is getting a lot of flack back in Russia about this war. And so he orders the Duma, which is their version of the parliament, disbanded because they were arguing against him all the time. They refused. Kind of a power struggle ensued. Tsar Nicholas decides to go and take control of the army himself, hoping that his presence would provide that spark in order to help Russia win the war. He knew that if they lost the war, that his popularity and his monarchy was done. So that was his last-ditch effort to try to salvage all of that. And when he goes there, it doesn't fix all the problems. The problems are they're too large, their industry was too poor, and they weren't economically ready for it. And him being there doesn't fix any of those things. And so they continue to lose. Only now he can't fire a general to blame it on because it's now his baby. So Tsar Nicholas II, when the war keeps going poorly, and now he's out of Moscow, he's out of the capital, all of the key power players within Russia are free to manipulate and fight for control, and eventually they're going to take power in Moscow and force the Tsar to abdicate his throne or to step down. He does so. Now, when Germany finds out about all this, that there's turmoil and that the Tsar has stepped down and there's a power struggle within Russia, they launch a secret weapon. Vladimir Lenin was a Russian. He was a Russian socialist. If you remember in our Honors World History unit talking about Marxism and Karl Marx, he believed in Karl Marx's theory of government ownership of land, government ownership of business, and as a result, he got kicked out of Russia during the Tsar's reign. Well, Germany finds him and sends him back, puts him on a train, sends him back into Russia, knowing that he would be able to consolidate power and ultimately pull Russia out of the war, which would then take away one of the two sides that Germany was fighting. He does so. It's going to take 4 years before this process is done, but Vladimir Lenin is going to consolidate the opposition into the Bolshevik Party and help lead this Communist Party, eventually as it's called, take over in Russia. As a result, the Tsar and his family are rounded up and they are summarily executed. The idea there was the only way to get rid of that dynasty, that monarchy. The Tsar's family, Tsar Nicholas II, was a Romanov. They had been in charge of Russia for 305 years, and so the fear was, kind of like during Great Britain's revolution, if the monarch's still there or one of their heirs is still there, they may still take power. So getting rid of him was the best way to do that. And so they execute the Tsar and his entire family, including his smallest children, including Anastasia, despite what Walt Disney wants to tell you. And so it's at that point that Russia comes up with a new government, and they're going to pull themselves out of this war, and they're going to become the United Soviet Socialist Republics by 1921. And they're going to become the world's first communist government. But it takes 3 years worth of revolutions before Vladimir Lenin's able to consolidate control. But either way, they leave the war, which then opens up the possibility for Russia or for Germany to fight just on the Western Front. They can move all the troops that were fighting the Russians over to fight in the Western Front, and opens up a new possibility for Germany. Now, it's at this point that Germany decides to gamble a little bit. They think now they should have the advantage in the Western Front, and they roll the dice and they decide if we can start sinking all the ships, including passenger ships, coming into Great Britain, that we could likely knock Great Britain out of the war. They knew that doing that would upset the United States and that we would eventually get involved, but they were hoping that Britain was weak enough and France were weak enough at that point that if they could win before we got involved, we wouldn't keep coming over just to fight Germany over in Europe with nothing to fight, no place to land, etc. So they began unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, to hedge their bets, Germany made a mistake. They sent a telegram to the foreign minister in Mexico, and we've already talked about some of the problems we were having with Mexico. And they offered to help Mexico fight the United States and regain the territories that we had won in the Mexican-American War, regain Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, later on, if they would start a war with us in 1917 to distract us and allow them to win the war in Europe. A British secret agent intercepted that telegram and, of course, turned it over to the United States. When the American people and the American government found out about that telegram, they were not very happy. They were PO'd, personally offended. And so that's when that's when the American people start clamoring for war. On April 6, 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to formally declare war on Germany. Ironic, because Woodrow Wilson had just won re-election in 1916 on the promises that he had kept America safe and kept us out of war, and now he's asking for a declaration of war. He tries to then switch it propaganda-wise and say that this war is important to the United States after years of campaigning on the fact that it wasn't, by saying that this was the war to make the world safe for democracy, because after the Soviet Union left, you now have basically democratic Britain, democratic France, democratic United States if we join, versus the last monarchies of Europe. Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the German monarchy, the Ottoman Empire monarchy. So he tried to play on that democracy versus monarchy system. He also said that this was the war to end all wars, that this war was so terrible, so bad, that it's important that the right side wins it so that they can ensure a lasting peace. And if you let these dictators win, then there's likelihood of being another war down the road. So the United States then decides to go to war. We vote to declare war, and we begin mobilizing. And it takes a while to mobilize. The United States doesn't keep a very large army traditionally, and so they have to draft soldiers, they have to train them, they have to make arrangements for getting soldiers on ships and getting them sent to Europe. They've got to raise supply, they've got to make uniforms, they've got to order and make ammunition and guns and all the things needed for war, and it's not going to happen right away. A lot of factories had to be converted to making those types of weapons, and so we create a War Industries Board, and this board's job was to regulate businesses. Now, in World War I, we don't have government-mandated rationing, but we do have voluntary rationing, kind of theme days. They started doing gasless Sundays, where everybody was encouraged not to buy gas on Sundays. That way, hopefully, you'd cut out 1/7 of our use of gas, then we have more for fighting the war. Lightless nights, where voluntarily people were not supposed to have the light on past dark on certain nights of the week, and then that way it would cut down our electricity, which would cut down our coal expenditures, because coal was our main power source at that time. Different things to kind of conserve food. They had meatless Mondays, sweetless Tuesdays, wheatless days, porkless days, just trying to conserve food. The person in charge of that is a guy by the name of Herbert Hoover, who will become far more famous in our next unit talking about the Great Depression. They create a committee on public information headed by a journalist, George Creel, who was in charge of our propaganda, promoting the war, getting everybody positive and upbeat, getting everybody behind going to war. We do start to see some women, not nearly as much as in World War II, entering into the workforce, taking on traditionally male roles, factories, railroad workers, not nearly as much as World War II, just by the sheer scope of World War II. The need was higher, but you start to see some of that. We passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. This happens a lot in the United States during times of war. And once again, we passed a law limiting people's free speech during times of war. A person can be fined between $10,000 and spend up to 20 years in prison for anything that they said, spoke, or did that would undermine the war effort. It discouraged labor unions. Essentially, people couldn't go on strike for poor wages during World War I because their labor was vital. Discouraged a lot of anti-war views. So the United States gets sent over. And the first set of American soldiers start arriving late in 1917, and one of our biggest fights was keeping our soldiers together. The European allies, who were battle-tested and been fighting in the trenches for 3.5 years, wanted to sprinkle American soldiers into the lines all across the front, putting them under foreign command and using them as fresh soldiers. Americans were not at all happy with that idea. For us, we said, we've seen what you've done with your soldiers. You make them run at machine guns all day long. So we pushed very hard to just insert the entire American Expeditionary Force into one section of the line and keep them under an American commander, at least the main American commander, and then there'd be a European overall general of the whole thing, but that they'd be under command of American soldiers, generals, and that general was John J. Blackjack Pershing. The European countries said, no, that's a terrible idea, and we threatened to not come over and help. And of course, that changed their mind very quickly. In the end, the European countries were right. We were the weak spot. We were the bunch of novices who were not battle tested, and so the Germans, of course, attacked our area first and made a push. They made their biggest advancement that they had in 3 years. But one thing about Americans is we learn quickly, and so very quickly we're able to fight back. And at the Second Battle of the Marne, we're able to make a giant advance into the German lines and turn the tide of the war. The Battle of St. Mihiel, Americans fought and ousted the Germans and sent them into retreat again. And so our entrance definitely tips the balance, tips the tide, just like the Germans were afraid of. And so by the end of 1918, it's pretty clear that all of these American forces flooding over, all the American food and weapons and ammunition flooding over, were overwhelming the Germans. And so it's at that point that Germany starts to realize that the end is near, that it's only going to get worse from there. It's kind of like a boxer fighting in the ring, and two boxers are just trading blows for 12 rounds and wearing each other out. And then halfway through the 12th round, one of the boxers can tag in a fresh guy, and he just walks in all full of energy and knocks the guy out. Well, we're that boxer that got tagged in. We definitely tipped the balance. We definitely won the war based on the labor of others. So the United States comes in and throws the knockout punch, ends the war, and President Woodrow Wilson has developed a list of what he felt like, sitting on the outside looking in, were all of the problems that led up to this war. He identified a lot of the things that we talked about: the nationalism, the entangling alliances, the imperialism, all these problems leading up. And so he comes up with this plan for what he felt the treaty ending the war should look like, and how that would hopefully set up a situation where you avoided anything like this from happening again. 6 key points were eliminating these secret treaties between countries, freedoms of the sea, no unrestricted submarine warfare, no economic barriers, reduction of armaments, lessen that militarism, readjusting colonial borders, fixing our imperialism problem, and then creating a League of Nations that would create a forum that these countries could all go to and work out their differences in an open setting where everybody had representatives, rather than try to do it diplomatically amongst countries and in different capitals. It's about that time, the last end of the war here, that this flu epidemic that you guys learned about the other day really starts to take hold. It affects about 1/4 of the U.S. population. Businesses shut down, services are suspended, people are running out of coffins, going weeks without being able to bury bodies. We talked about how the disease itself actually attached itself to red blood cells. So the 18 to 40-year-olds who were most healthy normally were the ones who were most affected by this disease and the ones that were dying from this disease. Epidemic killed many soldiers overseas. Approximately 500,000 Americans were killed. That's a lot more than our little flu crisis we're having now, or any of the others that we've had, the avian flu or the swine flu, all that stuff. But not just in America. It's believed that the epidemic might have killed as many as 30 million people worldwide. And that spring, just as quickly as it came on, it was gone. So it's at this stage here that you come into the fall of 1918 and the dominoes start falling in reverse. Bulgaria surrenders in September of 1918 and leaves the war. The Ottoman Empire surrenders in October of 1918 and leaves the war. Austro-Hungary as a nation splits up into a separate Austria and Hungary, and they leave the war, and they were the main one behind it to begin with. And that leaves just Germany fighting against the combined forces of Great Britain, the United States, and France. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicates his throne, and Germany creates a new republic. And that new republic is going to meet with the French and the British and the American officials. They'll come in on a railway car and they will sign an armistice, which is a ceasefire, at 11 a.m. on November 11th of 1918. So 11 o'clock at 11/11, 1918, Germany signs an armistice stopping the fighting temporarily. It's just both sides agreeing to no longer continue fighting, and they're going to sit down and try to figure out the end of this war. At this point, there are 8.5 million soldiers who've died as a result. And the Allies decide to meet in January 1919 in Paris, France, to decide what treaty it will take to actually officially end the war. President Wilson's going to be invited to that, as is the leaders of France, Great Britain, and Italy, the main Allied powers still remaining. The countries who don't get invited are Germany. And so you can see here the casualties, the number of dead between Russia, 1.7 million, France, 1.4, Great Britain, about 900,000 or so, in the United States, about 150,000. On the Axis side, Germany loses 1.8 million dead, Austro-Hungary 1.1 million dead. The Allies want revenge, especially on Germany. France, Great Britain felt like they had nothing to do with this thing, and Germany is the one who instigated it. So Austro-Hungary is gone, can't really blame them, plus Germany is the one that attacked them, so they want revenge. Europe itself is exhausted by this. We talked about how they had parades and rejoiced when the war started. Well, they're going to have parades and rejoice when it's over. 22 million total dead, half of which are civilians, another 20 million wounded, 48,000 Americans killed, 200,000 wounded. And so they decide Germany needs to pay for this war, literally and figuratively. Paris Peace Conference, Victoria Orlando from Italy is there. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. French Premier Georges Clemenceau, the big tiger, is there. President Woodrow Wilson is there, and Orlando. So these leaders here are all going in person, which was unique in history at that time as well. Typically, countries sent ambassadors to negotiate the treaty, but this one was so big and so momentous that the actual leaders of these four countries all showed up. That's why they called it the Big Four, and they all came in person. That was a really big deal, even in the United States, that our president was going to leave for weeks at a time over to Europe. Back when communication wasn't what it is today, he was going to be out of the loop a little bit, just responding back and forth with telegrams. The United States comes into this with an entirely different perspective. We wanted to fix all of the problems. We had the outsider's perspective. We saw the mistakes on both sides. We knew the best way to get rid of it and fix it. The other three, they wanted revenge. They had higher casualties than us. They had invested more money than us. They had been actually attacked by Germany, where we entered into this voluntarily. And so we were not going to agree. Great Britain wants Germany's navy dismantled. That was the big arms race leading into this for them. France wants some territory back in a buffer zone to prevent from further attacks. European countries want Germany to pay figuratively and literally for this. These are the people here that they're looking at when they're making these decisions. This entire generation of people in France and Great Britain who are going to go the rest of their lives missing limbs in a very not handicap-friendly society in 19-teens. So they sit down and come up with the Treaty of Versailles. Germany has no part in this. They can't negotiate this. They're basically handed this treaty and said, if you want this war to be over, sign it. Now, Germany could have continued the war, but they knew they were in no position to do it. They were already losing at that point, and the influx of American soldiers and material and supplies pretty much assured that they were not going to turn the tide anytime soon. And so rather than just completely be destroyed, new government says, fine, and they agree to this. The treaty itself calls to limit the size of Germany quite a bit. All the land that Germany had gained from Russia is given back. The German military itself basically ceases to exist. They can have no navy and only 100,000 soldiers total, mostly just for protecting their own borders or basically for civilian defense, to protect their people from rising up against the government. They had to pay at the end when they signed the treaty that the dollar figure isn't even known. They just tell them you're going to pay for this and kind of give them an idea of how it was going to be structured. Eventually they'll come back to them with the bill, and the bill will be $33 billion that Germany will have to pay back the Allies for every dead body, every person was assigned a dollar value, every shell used against them, the destruction of the land, all the food and material. They just figure up a bill for what this war cost them, and that's what they charge Germany. Germany has to return a lot of land in the Alsace-Lorraine region between France and Germany that they had taken in 1870. You can see here on this map, Germany's in brown. The stuff in blue is the territory Germany had to give up as a result of this war. So this was German territory leading into the war that is no longer their territory afterwards. The purple stuff is stuff that Russia had given up when they left the war, that is going to be split into new countries: Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Finland, etc. And then you can see in green all the territory that used to be Austro-Hungary that gets all split up, and you get the countries of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and stuff. So a lot of changes on the map of Europe as a result of this. Here's a picture of the Hall of Mirrors, where all these people met to negotiate this at the Palace of Versailles. If you remember our Honors World History class talking about the Palace of Versailles, this is the Hall of Mirrors just outside of Paris. Pretty large group of people. Just another map here showing you all of the different territorial exchanges and changes between hands here. They're going to create a demilitarized zone there in yellow, in which the Germans still control that territory on either side of the Rhine River. They're just outlawed having any troops whatsoever in that territory. creating a buffer zone. The idea being that if Germany ever wanted to attack France again, they would have to enter into that Rhine zone first, and then the French could immediately rush in and fight the war on the German side of things instead of the French side of things this time. The only part of President Wilson's 14 points that actually gets implemented, is the League of Nations. They pretty much reject every other suggestion that he had. And the League of Nations was supposed to promote international cooperation, keep the peace, give them a place to talk. Problem was they'd never invite Germany and Austria and Hungary, the countries that they most needed to have there to talk with. It just became another large alliance, kind of like they had before the war. So even in practice, the one thing of Wilson's they adopted doesn't actually do what he wanted it to do. The United States itself never joins the League of Nations because one of the caveats to the League Charter was that if anybody attacked a member nation, they would all go to war to prevent them. And according to the U.S. Constitution, our Congress gets to declare war, and so our Congress also gets to ratify all treaties. And when President Wilson brings this treaty home, our U.S. Congress votes it down. They do not agree to the treaty, therefore they do not join the League of Nations. So even here, Wilson kind of fails on this front. He goes on a whistle-stop train tour around the country trying to convince the American people to convince their senators to vote for this treaty to the point of exhaustion. He travels up and down across the country, stopping at every little bitty town, giving speeches why the treaty was important, how it would be fixed after we joined it, how nothing would be changed if we didn't. But it wasn't enough to convince the American people. Wilson will actually suffer a paralytic stroke because he's working so hard pushing this, and he'll end up serving out the rest of his term as president without the ability to communicate very well or write with his right hand. His wife, Edith Wilson, ends up having to sign everything for him the rest of his presidential term, although that was kept pretty quiet. The legacy itself. We talk about the legacy, the lasting impact of something. And the lasting impact of World War I was that it ended the last great monarchies of Europe, Germany, Russia, Austro-Hungary. Those were the last true functioning monarchies. They all become some versions of democracies or republics or communist countries in the case of Russia after the war. It established or reestablished the countries of Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, separate Hungary, Turkey, and the USSR. The harsh treaty itself is going to lead us directly into World War II. They stuck it to Germany. That was their whole concept, their whole idea. Problem was Germany was coming up with a democracy about this time, and democracies don't work well in terrible economic times, and that's what a lot of the Treaty of Versailles did. Germany's going to go through a massive depression about a decade before the United States does. Their people become desperate. They blame the new government. They become desperate for leadership, and a crazy mustached guy who is going to come answer the bell by the early 1930s, and the German people are going to blindly follow him because he offers hope in a very desperate time. And so we'll talk more about that in our next unit. And then the last one is that it does create the League of Nations. Although it was a pretty failed attempt at the time, it does lay the groundwork for what we will know as the United Nations years later that has been more of a success anyway. And that is the end of our unit. So hopefully you've learned some stuff here, and we'll move on to the 1920s and the Great Depression.